Round of applause, Allegra. Great to have you. Come on up. So Allegra is a postdoctoral fellow working at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where she investigates soil pathways to remove and store carbon dioxide. So Allegra, just tell us before you jump in here, why did you decide to study dirt?
We call it soil, James. I'm really interested in soil because it's really at the intersection between water, sun, the underlying geology, and then it's really the foundation of plant life, animal life, our own lives. It nourishes us through our food systems. And so climate change can actually feed back onto soil. So it's really interesting how climate change can affect our food production, our food systems, but also how our food systems and the way that we manage those systems can feed backwards onto climate change. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this little talk. There we go. I was one of the authors of the soils chapter of the Roadster Removal report, which you just heard a great overview of. I want to thank all of the other co-authors from many institutions. Their names are on the list, and especially the guidance from Eric Slesserev, who's now at Yale University. And one of the things that we haven't really touched on yet in this overview is the difference between the four pathways when it comes to carbon storage and durability. Forests and soils, you can see here cumulative removal, carbon dioxide removal on the y-axis, and time on the x-axis. And there's great potential for all four pathways that we talked about: forests, soils, direct air capture, and biomass with carbon storage. But there's a really big difference in storing carbon in geologic storage. You can kind of more closely equate that to an emission. That's really a permanent way of storing things. Forests and soils, on the other hand, are vulnerable to change. We require a kind of consistent management when we're changing cropland soils, if we're implementing a cover crop, in order to have that carbon stay out of the atmosphere. Now, this is purely from a biophysical standpoint. That needs to stay there for a long time. We need to invest long-term in that management strategy. So I want to acknowledge here that soils and forests, but I'll focus on soils. It's an amazing opportunity for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to talk about all of those. And the durability of that carbon stored in soil isn't guaranteed. So it's an investment that we need to continue making. So even though it's less durable, it is available to us now. These are practices that already exist. So how can soils contribute to carbon dioxide removal? Well, like JP said, the original carbon removal is photosynthesis. So in our agricultural systems right now, there's often a period of bare soil where you're rotating through annual crops, and there's a period of fallow where that soil is resting and nothing is growing on there. If we can anywhere, whether it's on the borders or throughout time, increase the amount of time that the duration during which plants are growing, we're increasing the total amount of photosynthesis, and therefore increasing the amount of carbon that's being sucked out of the atmosphere directly, pumped through the roots of that plant, and some portion of that can be stored in soil for years to centuries, sometimes even millennia. We looked at 3 specific practices, and there are many practices that can increase soil carbon, but we chose 3 practices that specifically increase photosynthesis. And that's because it's straightforward to account for that carbon's coming directly out of the atmosphere and then being stored in soil. We're not thinking about transporting it laterally. But I'm really excited to hear from some of our panelists later to get that perspective of the whole life cycle of some other potential carbon removal practices. The other benefit of the practices that we chose is that they're actually originally designed not for carbon removal. Carbon removal is a bonus. They're originally designed to reduce erosion, to reduce the loss of soils, like what happened in the Dust Bowl early on. They're designed to increase water infiltration. They're designed to keep that soil down, keep water and reduce erosion, and also increase habitat for pollinators, which is really important, especially here in the Central Valley. So those are the three practices that we use. We've heard about it now 3 times, so I won't go into detail about what they are. Cover cropping, perennial field borders, and a switchgrass perennial carbon crop, which isn't quite as relevant for us here in California. But what I want to notice is that we went into detail about what the baseline is. We wanted to account for nitrous oxide emissions from implementing these practices, all sorts of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the carbon baseline. We looked at whether the soil carbon is already being lost. We didn't include that as a carbon removal in that case. But we were only able to look at, for the sake of the national scale inventory, the 7 major commodity crops that are the largest crops in the United States, which unfortunately are not the same as the largest commodity crops in California. So we looked at corn, soy, wheat, oats, hay, cotton, peanuts, sorghum, and barley. And you'll notice in the map on the right that those crops aren't very well represented in California. But we do know that there's a lot of opportunity for agricultural soil carbon sequestration in California. So I want to point out what the baselines that were excluded in this analysis. Perennial tree crops, that's a big one here in Merced, where almonds are one of the major crops. We looked up, so unfortunately, we weren't able to include almonds, citrus trees, specialty crops like strawberries, grapes, lettuce, and one of my fellow panelists will be a melon grower as well. We weren't able to include that as one of the baselines, but he'll be able to tell you later that there's still lots of opportunity there. So what we did that's pretty different from what's been done before is that we took that baseline management, we traced over 38,000 points in the United States where there's cropland growing, which is a whole bunch of different types of crops. We traced how implementing each of the 3 practices will change A, soil carbon, B, the nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas emissions from implementing that. And then thirdly, we looked at the change in the cash crop yield, because that's really important also for the farmer's bottom line. Is this going to enhance the yield or detract from yield? And that's different in each county and each climate and with each practice. And then for each of those 38,000 points, then we evaluated the economics of it. Basically, if we incentivize a climate benefit, which includes avoided emissions as well as carbon dioxide removal, that will be income to the farmer. And then we subtracted the cost of implementation as well as any foregone cash crop income that might happen if yield decreased. So we really wanted to make sure that we only counted as potential wherever the farmer's bottom line is positive or not impacted at all. So if a farmer would be losing money from implementing these practices, we said, okay, that's not going to happen. So here's the economically constrained results popping out at you. The skyscrapers popping out at you are showing the total cumulative amount of carbon dioxide that we can sequester by 2050. And what you can see is the green is cover crops, the yellow is showing our switchgrass and perennial carbon crops, and the blue is perennial field borders. And you can see that those cover crops are really popping out at you. Those are mostly green skyscrapers, and that's because they're the most economical. They're not competing with cash crops at all, almost anywhere. And so where we can implement them, where there's rain-fed winter crops, that's going to be a really big economic win, both for the farmers and for folks who are really interested in mitigating climate and kind of contributing to a climate change solution. I want to point out, too, that it really matters how much you pay the farmer. JP alluded to this earlier in her talk. If you pay farmers $40 a ton per CO2 that they've drawn down because of cover crops or planting perennials, you can remove about 130 million tons by 2050 throughout the United States. And that number increases dramatically once we pay farmers more, once we incentivize more carbon. So this map would look different and really be expansive if we can pay more, and especially in California where there's high-value crops being grown right now. So what does this mean for California Central Valley? Now I'm excited to get into this discussion. First of all, we know, especially in Merced County where there's lots of orchards, perennial and year-round crops are already dominating. So you're already kind of ahead of the game there with planting perennials. So there's lower opportunity for that implementation. That's not to say, though, that there's not a lot of opportunity for winter cover crops and these other specialty crops that you're growing. We're going to hear more about that from the panel. I did a post-haste analysis because I was interested in California itself, just to see, okay, if we look at Merced County alone, planting inter-row cover grasses, what might the potential be here in Merced County? And what we found is that, through 2050, in the next 25 years, if we accumulate all of the carbon that you could sequester in soil in those years, just by planting cover grasses in orchards, we could remove about over 0.7 million tons of CO2 by 2050. But acknowledging that might cost about $100 a ton. So it's not cheap, but with incentives, that's like a pretty significant possibility. And then finally, I want to acknowledge again that there are other practices that are going to be super useful here in California, especially amending croplands with compost, or rangelands even with compost or biochar. There's rock dust amendments are becoming a popular option for inorganic carbon removal. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from the rest of our panel about some of the options that are really local and going to be useful here. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, I'd like to welcome our other panelists to come to the stage now. Joe Del Bosque. So Joe is a farmer in Faribault, California, and where he farms organic melons, cherries, almonds, tomatoes. Joe, come on up. Rebecca Riles, a professor here at UC Merced. Welcome, Rebecca. And Temret Gazay, good to see you again, Temret. Soil physics professor here at UC Merced. So I'd love to start with a question for you, Rebecca, about your lab's work here at UC Merced, and what additional benefits are conferred by some of the techniques that were discussed today, and what might have been left out of this report, since the soils, as we heard from Allegra, the soils chapter focused most on these commodity crops, which are not grown here. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and I was really excited to read the Roads to Removal report, and a big light shining down on the amazing capacity of our soils and our natural and working landscapes to be part of the climate solution, and having some good data behind that. As Allegra pointed out, unfortunately, some of the opportunities that we have here in California didn't really shine through because of the limitations that's needed for that nationwide approach that they used. And so I'm here to say that there is opportunity here in California. It might look a little bit different than switchgrass, which doesn't make a lot of sense economically. And there are opportunities in our croplands, in our rangelands, and in our orchards. There are carbon farming practices already that are recognized and incentivized by the California Department of Food and Agriculture through its Healthy Soils program. There's about 41 practices right now that farmers can apply for funding to implement. And there are researchers all across the state looking at more novel practices or stacking practices to really understand the opportunities that are there. And the reason why it's challenging is because California has a highly diverse agricultural landscape, both in terms of the soils, the types of crops that are grown, are highly variable weather, and the climate change impacts that we're seeing. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity for doing research to figure out that question a little bit more. So my lab, what we're really hoping to do is collect new data that helps to improve maybe Roads to Removal 2.0, where we have enough localized data that we can power up those models that they use to the specific and diverse landscape that we have here. A lot of the work that we do is on-farm research, so we partner with farmers who are doing these novel practices already or interested in trying something new. That provides realistic data on the challenges that farmers see. It provides a little noise to the data also, and is a challenge to do this work. And we also think about connecting our local agricultural systems. I think some of this will resonate in the BiCRS panel later today, but a lot of the research that we do tries to identify those wasted organic residues, transform them into something more stable like compost or biochar, and return those to the soil and provide the benefits of carbon storage and many other co-benefits that come with that. So I'll just talk about a couple examples that show this kind of work. I started this work really in rangelands, as Allegra mentioned, which is not included in the report. The work that I got started during my PhD was looking at applying compost to rangelands. We applied it one time 15 years ago, and essentially what they did was boost the power of the plants to photosynthesize, really changed the state of that system. Still today, the plots where we added compost, they green up sooner. These annual grasses grow longer, drawing more of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And providing a lot of co-benefits too. More plants growing means more forage for the cows.
Just the other panelists, could you turn off your mic if you're not speaking, just for feedback? Sorry, go ahead, keep going.
Oh, thanks. So this was first done in the Sierra foothills and along the coast, but we've replicated it throughout the state right now and are seeing similar results. So I think that's one area. It's not just the compost, that organic waste being diverted from landfills where it produces methane, but the carbon from that compost being returned to the soil, boosting the power of that ecosystem to pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in stable carbon pools. More recently, our lab's been working in orchards because it's such a dominant crop here in the Central Valley. We have a number of projects, and one thing that we do is really stack a number of practices together. This is in practice what a lot of farmers are doing too, not just one carbon farming practice, but many of them. That makes it a challenge to do research, but it's really fun to do it that way. So for example, we've been doing a trial in a number of orchards across the San Joaquin Valley where we apply compost and cover crops and have been tracking benefits in terms of soil health. Our carbon numbers are in process, so we can't say anything concrete about the magnitude of drawdown, but we do see benefits from the ecosystem, including things like reducing tree water stress, which is really important.
Rebecca, on that note, when you talk about orchards and cover cropping on orchards, something that's come up or a question has been, what about water usage and competing for water, right? Because you're growing these crops, they're using water. Don't they take away the water from the trees or no?
Yeah, and I think we'll hear Joe's perspective too, but my understanding from the farmers that I've worked with is if it's a practice that's going to cost a lot of water, it's really not going to be worth doing. So in orchard systems, cover crops are typically planted during the winter, taking advantage of the winter rains. That is variable from year to year, of course, so sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't require extra water inputs, and they're growing at a time where the trees are dormant, so they're not competing for nutrients from the trees either. Those cover crops are usually terminated at the point at which the trees start needing a lot of resources from the soil.
Got it. So I want to go first, before we hear from the other panelists, any questions so far from what we heard from the presentation or panel so far? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is David Shabazian, and I'm the director for the California Department of Conservation. We have a program where we're helping farmers in the Central Valley, or San Joaquin in particular, repurpose their land in the face of SGMA. Have you looked at rewilding?
What does that mean for people who might not know what you were just describing? What is that?
It's basically putting in native plants to keep the landscape, at least, from just blowing dust all over the valley.
We haven't looked at that in my lab just yet, but there is a team of researchers, more from the water perspective, looking at that at UC Merced. I think that's another great opportunity too. We're in a state of transition with restrictions for water use to really figure out to do with land that might be fallow, agricultural land that might be fallowed. I would love to see that used for these carbon farming practices, or these carbon drawdown practices, and I think reestablishing native vegetation is a great way to do that, especially if you can establish perennial vegetation.
So Temret, I want to turn to you. So we've heard a lot about dollars per ton, right? And dollars per ton going to farmers. And so I want to drill into that a little bit. In order to actually, so let's say that there were the incentives in place or the markets in place, to provide dollars per ton. farmers would actually need to be able to show that they'd removed a certain amount of carbon to claim those dollars. There'd have to be some kind of verification, measurement, and reporting of that activity. And you're a soil physicist, so you've studied how carbon is retained in soils and how we might demonstrate it. So can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, in a world where there is money available to store carbon dioxide, how do you know that it's stored?
That's a very good question. It's a very challenging problem because the amount of carbon that we add to soils is very large in quantity, and at the same time, the amount of carbon that we lose every year is also very large in quantity. And the net difference, the one that we are trying to maximize, is a small difference between two large numbers. And those numbers are not consistent year after year or field to field, and therefore measurement alone is not going to be easy. So we have to combine some kind of modeling that allows us to estimate how much we are losing throughout the growing season, for example, and therefore we need to combine measurements and some kind of modeling, mechanistic modeling, that explains the rates of release of CO2, if you will.
How well can we do that today?
We can do that. The uncertainty is very high, but we generally understand the principles that are needed to be able to do that calculation. But we don't have the granularity at the farm scale that we need to make those calculations. So it remains somewhat challenging, but we can generalize based on some experiments that are being done.
Combination of modeling and testing, and we'll probably come back to this question, but I'd like to go to Joe, to you. I know you have a couple of slides. So again, Joe, do you want to show your slides and tell us about the work that you do here in this region and what you farm and how you think about some of the topics we've covered so far today?
Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here and talk a little bit about agriculture here in the Valley. I think we missed a slide here, but there's one about melons here that we're going to start with, but that's okay. I farm in the, I farm in the southwest corner of Merced County and northwest corner of Fresno County on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. As was mentioned, we grow melons and almonds, tomatoes, and so forth. We farm in the Central Valley Project, so we irrigate our crops with federal water. One thing that I cannot overemphasize is California climate is different than the rest of the United States. Okay, it is different. We have a Mediterranean climate here. It's a very special climate. It allows us to grow fruits, nuts, and vegetables you can't grow anywhere else, but they all have to be irrigated. So anytime that we talk agriculture in California, do not forget, there's always water that is needed, okay? And it's very important. So there's been a lot of changes in agriculture in California over the last 30, 40 years. And I can tell you a little bit about some of the things that we've done here, mostly in the interest of conserving water, but a lot of this, there's always also an energy nexus, right? So one of the things that we did a long time ago, I'm talking 40 years ago, when I first started farming, and I didn't have any money, and I thought, how do I get my cost down growing melons? And so I got this idea. I didn't even know what it was at the time, but now you call it minimum tillage or reduced tillage, okay? So I only had one tractor, and it wasn't a very big tractor. So I was able to grow melons where it used to take 14 trips across the field through the growing season. I reduced it to 7. I reduced our carbon emissions, right? I didn't know that. I didn't care at the time. I just knew it was costing me less. And what I did learn was that I didn't lose production. In fact, I might have gained a little bit of production. And I saved a little water. At that time, it didn't matter either because water was not a problem in 1984. But in the 1990s, it was a problem And then we started looking for ways to conserve water. And so one of the first things that we did was look at higher tech irrigation systems. So drip irrigation, you don't see it in that field there. Every bed in that field has a drip line buried 13 inches deep. It's there, okay? And so around 1997, we started playing with drip irrigation. We didn't know what we were doing, but we knew we had to do it. And so we did it to save water. And lo and behold, yes, we found that we could grow a crop of melons with 30 to 35% less water. Okay, that was great. Bigger surprise, we gained production by 30 or 35%. So that was huge. It was a huge bonus. Again, the energy nexus, we didn't think about it, but here's the thing. Water costs a lot of energy to move in this state. We take water from the upper Sacramento River and move it all the way down here. The state takes water from Oroville, moves it down to San Diego. You don't think that takes some energy? It does. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. So we saved some of that energy by using less water, and we gained more production with less water. Okay, so we continued with that till today. And the whole farm, every square foot of farm on my farm has drip irrigation. So some of the other things that we did along the way, we started using compost, things like that. There is a program called Healthy Soils. We participate in that. It has a limit. We can only do like 150 acres a year. Kind of limited. We wish it was expanded a little bit more. You want to go ahead and change the slide? Here's a couple of our crops, okay? In the middle is a cover crop that we planted. It's kind of a beautiful picture, don't you think? And then on the left is the cover crop when it's mature. Now, we only plant cover crops in the wintertime because we cannot afford to use water on cover crops. Cover crop, it has benefits, but money isn't one of them, okay? And so, well, sometimes we do. If it rains a lot, like last year, we get a cover crop as beautiful as the one on the left, we can actually sell it to the dairies, okay? Doesn't happen every year. There's some years that it looks like the one in the middle at the end of the season and there's nothing there, okay? It's hit and miss. We can't afford to water cover crops, okay? Our main crop that we make income is on the right. That's our melons, right? Those are organic melons. You can see on the on the upper side is our almonds. In between the melons and the almonds, we have a hedgerow it includes those beautiful sunflowers, some corn, and some flowering plants for the bees. They are not perennial like the idea suggested, so that's something that we consider. But that's kind of our program right there. And underneath those melons, as I said, is a drip irrigation line that we water with. Is it okay?
Excellent.
Are we okay with time? Or?
Yeah, keep going.
Well, if you want to change on this slide, here are some almonds that you see lately out there on the west side. This is sad. There is some carbon being captured there. This is not what we want to do with almonds, but you can see that they've been pulled out on the far left. In the middle, they've been ground up and put in piles. And then on the right, that's spread out over the fields. There is a program with the Air Board to help subsidize some of this. It's not a lot of money. It doesn't even pay for the process of getting those trees destroyed. But anyway, this is something that I did want to present that one of the things that has happened in the last 25 years, more permanent crops have been grown in the valley, mostly nuts, but also fruit trees and so forth. And those things, I'm not a scientist, but I imagine they capture a lot of carbon. So I wanted to present that and show that to you.
Allegra, I wonder if you could take this question. So what we're seeing in that slide that Joe just brought up is basically taking this biomass from the trees, grinding it up, and spreading it across the fields, right? And presumably that has some benefit to the soils and their ability to function and to, to ultimately to capture some carbon in the future. How would you compare, strategies like that to disposing of the biomass in other ways, i.e. BiCRS, the other pathway that we're talking about? Because it seems to me there's sort of, there's two options here, what to do with these trees. What should we be doing with the trees? I mean, what's going to have the better carbon benefit?
Well, these trees used to be sent to a biomass plant.
Meaning where they would be combusted,
yes,
for energy, and the emissions would be released into the air.
Right, and that's discouraged now.
It's an interesting question, because I think, as Joe will say too, having a closed cycle of nutrients is also beneficial to the soil and important for growing crops. So the more that you export biomass from the fields, that can also sometimes have a detrimental effect. So in some ways it's really nice that they're amending at least some of their biomass to the soil. That said, when it comes to carbon dioxide removal, if we're thinking specifically just from a climate perspective, because there's lots of perspectives to think about here, but if we think about it from a climate perspective, the carbon that was in the biomass that you're now putting on soil, some of that will last for a while. That's what I was talking about, durability, but it's not going to be permanently stored in that soil, right? Will it contribute to a cycle? Yes, and that's important too. But for exporting some portion of that, a sustainable portion, which I couldn't tell you what that is, but not all of it, to a biomass facility where it's extracted specifically for geologic storage, pumped down underground, that will have a more lasting impact from a climate perspective. It's a balance. It comes down to a balance, because if all of that is exported, like you said, then you're exporting all of the carbon from the fields, and these are growing food for our to nourish people. So it's really important to balance both.
So one more question, then I'd love to get questions from the audience. But again, for you, Allegra, the solutions or the processes that you proposed for for soils, so cover cropping and the others, how long does it take farmers to see the benefit of these practices? Is this an overnight thing, or does it take a long time? And give us some context around the value that's conferred.
Well, I think actually all three of our panelists could probably answer this as
Great.
well. We did look, modeled the impact, and you would see, you wouldn't be able to measure, as Tamrat mentioned, it's hard to measure small changes when there's already lots of carbon in the soil. You'd probably see a change in the first few years, but you wouldn't really be able to measure it. It's kind of an accumulation over time where you really see that benefit, and maybe you all can add your expertise.
I would just add, it depends on what metrics you're thinking about. I'm assuming that the question was about carbon in particular. When would the farmer see the changes in carbon? But for the co-benefits that come with it, some of those co-benefits happen right away. So by doing whole orchard recycling, adding compost, cover crops in orchards, immediately that season we see improvements in water retention, which is really important, enhanced retention of nitrogen and increased crop yields. So some of those benefits that are really valuable to the farmer can be seen sooner than the changes in carbon, but we can use some of the scientific tools that Tamara was talking about to look at indications for how that carbon is likely to move in the future.
And Joe, does that resonate with you? When you started to use cover crops, did you see these? Why do you do it year after year?
Well, we farmers understand the carbon cycle up to the plant and to the fruit, right? What happens in the soil, we don't have a great understanding of, but we understand that we do benefit from carbon in the soil to some extent. When we did cover cropping, we did notice greatly increased tilth of the soil, fertility of the soil. Of course, we also increased the biology of soil, so we ended up having some soil pests that increased in the soil that we were a little bit taken aback from. Now, when you get too much carbon, like that picture on the right, on the soil, that is also has its own issues. Number one, that competes with your plant for nitrogen. So we need to probably put a lot of nitrogen in the soil to, satisfy the needs of the bacteria and everything that work on that biomass. So we don't understand that totally, but we do understand that it is going to take some nitrogen to take care of that issue.
And Tamara, what would you add?
So what Joe described is essentially the science that we try to translate to equations in my group, right? So we work in a Mediterranean climate where naturally the grasslands would go dry, and therefore the microbes in those soils go dormant and keep the carbon from going back to the atmosphere. But when we grow food, when we irrigate at that time, we provide water, and some cycling of organic matter is good, but we let the microbes go into overdrive. On top of that, if you till it, you provide them extra oxygen, so they go even more happy, and then they lose more carbon. So the kinds of practices that he's doing, like moving down the irrigation line below ground and keeping the soil slightly drier, reducing tillage and keeping the oxygen flow slightly slower, those are the kinds of things that would slow down the microbial process that releases organic matter to the atmosphere. So in the process, you save water, you save nutrients, you get more yield, right? So it works, it pays for itself, plus you get all these benefits. So we just have to think creatively to adjust our management in a way that we get multiple benefits.
Great. Audience.
I just felt like I had to correct this misconception and comment that I hear quite frequently about combustion at a biomass plant. So those were kind of the old school biomass plants, and you can no longer get permits for something like that. So the biomass plants we see today are not combusting. So I just want to correct any sort of misconception out there that that's what's happening. We're gasifying, so we bake. At a very high temperature, we bake the biomass.
Lonnie, do you want to introduce yourself real quick and Phoenix Energy and just describe what your facility does?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm with Phoenix Energy. We build BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage plants in the Sierra Nevadas. And with each plant, which are community scale, about 2 to 3 megawatts of carbon negative electricity is generated. And we also create biochar, which is carbon sequestration. And each plant sequesters about, what we're removing about 4,000 to 6,000, depending on the size of the plant, of metric tons of CO2.
Right.
And we feel really sad that farmers like Joe don't have a home for their fuel, because we think it's important that that doesn't lay on the ground and decompose and send the CO2 back up into the atmosphere when there is a good solution for it.
Thanks, Lonnie. Yes,
Thank
please. Oh, right behind you. If you could just introduce yourself and the organization or company that you're from. Thank
Good
you.
morning, I'm Julie Vance with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I just wanted to build on the SGMA comment. So the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires that groundwater basins become into balance by a certain point in time. And the projections are that at least 600,000 acres need to be taken out of production in the southern San Joaquin Valley, possibly closer to 800,000. And so your baseline will probably go down compared to what you've measured. The bright side, sort of, is that renewable energy companies see the San Joaquin Valley as the final frontier, and there's at least probably over 100,000 acres of solar proposed in the southern San Joaquin Valley. So that helps with one part of the equation, but not on the plant growing part of the equation. Except for that, many of the companies are willing to, or even interested in, growing plants in between the solar panels. So to the extent that you can look at what can maximize carbon capture that doesn't have to be irrigated would be extremely beneficial to the valley.
Agrovoltaics, very interesting area. Another question? Let's go to you.
Hi, so my question is for Joe.
Just introduce yourself and what organization you're from, or company?
Sounds good. I'm Isabella Cardenas. I'm with the East Stanislaus Resource Conservation District. It's a really long name. Um, so my question is for you, Joe. Are you by chance using biochar on your fields? Is that somewhat incorporated at all or anything?
Are you using biochar on your fields?
No, we are not using biochar. I still don't even know what it is, actually. And probably most
people here who
farmers out
could
there don't.
Sorry, keep going.
And I guess the second question is, with that orchard removal, are you going to reincorporate also almond trees, or are you going to change to something else or fallow that land?
So we're in a program where the Air Board helps subsidize the removal of the orchard if you keep all that biomass there. And it has to be incorporated into the soil. So yes, it's going to stay on the field.
Thank you.
Interesting. Sir.
Yeah, Mike Wolk, Corrigan. We operate a biorefinery here in Merced, so maybe you only need 299 more biorefineries instead of 300. My question is, maybe it's implicit in the report. You know, you have BiCRS as a lane, you have soil carbon as a lane. Biochar is produced within BiCRS, but there's clearly a crossover into soil carbon. Where does that sort of fall out in the report?
Great question. Like I mentioned, we didn't include, when it came to soil carbon, the intersection between the BiCRS and soil came from planting switchgrass, because we know directly that CO2 is coming from the atmosphere through down deep into the roots. So we did look at that crossover. When it comes to biochar, also compost, which is another piece that could definitely contribute. But when it comes to biochar, compost, any of the ag waste, or ag residue, it's not waste, we chose to simplify the problem by not, the issue is that the life cycle of the organic matter is complicated because you're moving that laterally from one place to another. So it's hard to account for the report is about carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, not just about soil carbon increase. Does it interact? Yes. Is it interesting and should we look at it? Yes. But this problem is much harder. So that's why we didn't include it at the scale that we're doing this report. There's definitely potential.
So those lanes kind of follow the permanence of the carbon removal.
He said, do those lanes follow permanence of carbon removal? Not exactly. More direct motion from atmosphere to storage. Because it's not as direct and there's some transportation and movement, especially when it comes to soil, because it's the carbon that is amended from biochar it's not only just carbon that stays there forever. Some of it does stay for a long time, longer than it would if it was just a wood chip, but also in some cases, and Becca is an expert on this as well, it's nourishing, it's acting as a slow release fertilizer. So it actually does get broken down eventually and can have actually long-term impacts on, as Becca was saying with the compost amendments, biochar similarly, long-term impacts on the productivity of grass, and therefore grass and trees and crops and whatever that are pumping carbon down through the roots. So it's actually a pretty complex system and a complex problem when it comes to accounting. Where is that carbon coming from? Which part of it is lateral? Which part of it is from the atmosphere? Because some of it is. And how long is it going to stay there? That's the reason we didn't include it in the report, but it is definitely worth thinking about, considering, and accounting for.
I'd like to ask just one more question to the panel, and this is, if you were to change any of the current policy frameworks in the state to incentivize more carbon removal via some of the techniques we've heard about today, right? What tweaks would those be? What changes would those be? Like Joe, you mentioned that you're part of a program that incentivizes leaving those trees in the soil, for example. Whereas we've heard that potentially there's more carbon removal if something else were done with those trees. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts, if anyone on our panel has any thoughts along those lines. It'd be interesting to hear that.
I think that most farmers would prefer not to have that much biomass on their soils. A small amount is good. Too much is probably too much. Now you're kind of growing another crop of biology in the soil that you're having to feed that's going to be working on this. So a little bit's good. We did a trial with probably 1/5 of that amount of biomass on an organic field. We saw some benefits, definitely. But that is an awful lot of material to decompose in the soil.
Thank you. And I think with that, we're actually going to take a break now for 10 minutes. And then if everyone could come back, and these panelists are here the whole day, so please come up to them, ask questions. Thanks, everybody. Let's take a break.